London, 1942. The air is heavy, saturated with fear and silence. The kind of silence that doesn't bring peace but holds its breath. Outside, the windows are painted black. Streetlights are dimmed. Headlights are shielded. The city, once electric with life, now hides in forced darkness. Because the bombs are falling, night after night, and the enemy in the sky never sleeps. But for all the horror descending from above, no one suspects the darkness below. No one suspects that another predator is walking among them. One not in uniform. One not speaking German. But one far more intimate. Far more terrifying. They would call him the Blackout Ripper. It started with the war. Or at least that's when the mask of civilization began to slip. In the early months of 1942, Britain found itself in a vulnerable state. Hitler's Luftwaffe had already reduced parts of London to rubble. Civilians were exhausted. Ration books replaced paychecks. Funerals outnumbered weddings, and women, millions of them, were stepping into roles left behind by the men who went off to fight. By day, they built airplanes, manned fire brigades, managed railways. But by night, they were alone. Alone in a city stripped of light. Alone in a world that felt like it might end at any moment. And in that loneliness, in that darkness, someone hunted. The first body appeared on a Monday. Her name was Evelyn Hamilton, a 41-year-old pharmacist. She was smart, independent, cautious. She'd spent the evening dining alone at a hotel near Marble Arch, preparing for a new job in the north of England. She never made it. The next morning, Evelyn's body was found in an air raid shelter. Strangled. Her handbag gone, her coat removed. But there were no signs of struggle. No bruises on her arms, no torn clothing. Whoever did this had done it quickly, efficiently, and calmly. The police chalked it up to robbery, a tragic casualty of wartime desperation. But it wasn't over. Just one day later, another woman was found. Evelyn Oatley, a 34-year-old actress turned sex worker known to her clients as Lita Ward. She had entertained a visitor in her flat on Wardour Street. Neighbours recalled hearing laughter, then silence. What they found the next morning was worse than anyone expected. Her throat had been slit. Her body mutilated with a tin opener and a curling iron. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a statement. And for those who could read the signs, it said something chilling. This wasn't random. This was ritual. Scotland Yard took notice. They didn't say so publicly, not yet, but the whispers inside the force began to grow louder. One victim might be chance. 2 in 2 days with such violence, that was something else. That was a pattern. The city, however, couldn't afford panic. Not while the Nazis were still dropping bombs. The government-controlled press didn't report the full horror. And so people went on. Women walked alone. Blackout curtains were drawn. The shadows remained. And the killer struck again. Just a day later, on Wednesday, the body of Margaret Florence Lowe was discovered in her flat in Soho. She was 43, a widow and mother who supplemented her income with occasional sex work. Like Evelyn Oatley, Margaret had been strangled, then brutally mutilated. The same tools, the same method, the same cold precision. This time police noticed something odd. Nothing had been stolen. Her purse, jewellery, money, they were all left behind. This wasn't about gain. This was about control. And the killer, he was evolving. He wasn't in a frenzy. He wasn't sloppy. He was growing more confident, more deliberate. The choice of weapons, the anatomical targeting, the staged positioning of the bodies. These weren't the acts of someone afraid of getting caught. They were the acts of someone who believed he wouldn't. And why would he? The city was drowning in chaos. Death was everywhere. Bombs by day, sirens by night. Who would notice one more scream in the blackout? But Scotland Yard noticed. And behind the scenes, they were scrambling. The Home Office quietly dispatched more detectives to Soho. Women were warned privately to stay indoors. And while newspapers still avoided the full story, the community of sex workers began to murmur. There was a killer out there, and he wasn't done. On Thursday, Doris Joanne, a 32-year-old woman, was found dead in her flat in Sussex Gardens, strangled with the same signature mutilations. Her husband, away serving in the RAF, had no idea his wife had been targeted by the man the press still hadn't named. But now the police couldn't deny it. 4 women, 4 nights, 1 killer. They had a serial murderer on their hands, and worse, he wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was thriving in them. The war, it turned out, was his greatest ally. The blackout was his camouflage. The fear in the streets made women easier to isolate. The bombs kept the public distracted. And the police were overwhelmed. This wasn't just murder. It was murder made possible by war. And that's what made it so terrifying. Because the Blackout Ripper wasn't a maniac in the woods. He was calm, social, polite. He knew the city, knew how to blend in. He might have even been in uniform, respected, admired, trusted. And he had just enough power to keep going. What the authorities didn't know, what London wouldn't discover until it was nearly too late, was that the killer had a name. And he had a history. His name was Gordon Frederick Cummins. And his story was only just beginning. Gordon Frederick Cummins. A name that in any other time might have faded quietly into the British class register, one among many polished young men with silver cufflinks and well-rehearsed smiles. But in the darkness of 1942, London, that name would soon become synonymous with horror, with cruelty, with death. He didn't look like a killer, and that's exactly what made him so dangerous. Cummins was born in 1914 in Yorkshire, England, to an unremarkable family. His early life wasn't marked by hardship or trauma. There were no whispers of abuse, no incidents of violence, no signs that would hint at the monster he would become. But there was something else, something harder to detect, a simmering arrogance, a hunger for status, and an insatiable need to be more than he was. Those who knew him in school described him as a bit of a fantasist. He told elaborate lies about his background, often pretending to be of aristocratic descent. He insisted on being called the Honourable Cummins, even though no such title was ever granted. He had a taste for expensive Cologne crisp uniforms and upper-class airs despite not having earned any of them. What he lacked in authenticity, he made up for in charm. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and command attention. Tall, handsome, with dark wavy hair and a carefully measured smile, Cummins looked like a romantic lead pulled straight from wartime propaganda. He spoke with confidence, laughed easily, and knew exactly how to make people trust him, especially women. But underneath that polished exterior was something cold, something calculated, and during the war that something began to grow. Cummins joined the Royal Air Force in 1941, quickly rising to the rank of leading aircraftman. His assignment brought him to Regent Street in London, where he was stationed during one of the most turbulent years in British history. There, among the bombed-out buildings and nightly blackouts, Cummins blended in perfectly, just another soldier doing his duty. Except he wasn't. Behind the scenes, his behaviour became increasingly erratic. He was known among fellow servicemen for boasting about violent fantasies. He drank heavily. He spoke of women in crude, degrading ways. One officer later recalled Cummins bragging about how easy it was to pick up girls during the blackouts. "They're all desperate," he'd said. "You just have to sound like a hero." And that was the key. The timing of his murders was no coincidence. They all occurred during his 6-day leave from the RAF, a window of freedom he used not for rest, but for ritual. He would stroll through Soho and Piccadilly areas flooded with displaced civilians and struggling sex workers. He wore his uniform proudly. It made him look safe, respectable, a protector in a city full of fear. He chose women who were vulnerable, not because they were weak, but because the war had made them disposable in the eyes of society. Widows, working class, sex workers, forgotten by the press, ignored by the police. These were the people Cummins could hurt without consequence, until one night his confidence betrayed him. On February 14, 1942, just a day after murdering Doris Joanne Cummins, struck again. This time his victim was 32-year-old Greta Hayward. She was walking alone on the Strand when he approached her. He was charming, charismatic, offering to escort her somewhere safe. Greta hesitated, but eventually agreed. After all, he was in uniform. But in a nearby air raid shelter, Cummins attacked. He threw her to the ground and attempted to strangle her. Greta fought back, kicked, screamed, and just as quickly as it began, he fled, leaving her gasping on the floor, shocked, confused, alive, and most importantly, able to talk. Greta Hayward became the break Scotland Yard was desperate for. She reported the attack immediately. She gave a description: a tall man in an RAF uniform, dark hair, well-spoken, smelling of cologne. The assault had occurred during a time when few were outside, and perhaps most crucially, Greta had seen his face clearly. The police began cross-referencing RAF personnel on leave in the area. The list was small, and among the names was one that stood out: Gordon Frederick Cummins. But they still needed proof. A name was just a lead. They needed to tie him physically to the crimes, and fate, along with Cummins' own arrogance, did just that. On the very next night, February 15th, the final known victim was found: 25-year-old Kathleen King. Unlike the previous victims, Kathleen survived. Cummins had taken her to a hotel in the West End. There he assaulted her, but for reasons still unclear, he left her alive. Perhaps he was interrupted. Perhaps he grew careless. Or perhaps some small decaying part of his mind wanted to be caught. Because he made a mistake. He dropped his gas mask. Inside the mask was a service number. The number belonged to Cummins. Within hours, police connected the dots. The attacks, the murders, the mutilations, and now a direct physical link tying Cummins to a crime scene. Scotland Yard moved fast. He was arrested on February 16th, just 2 days after the attack on Greta Hayward. But even in custody, Cummins played the role of the gentleman. He denied everything with icy politeness. He smiled during questioning. He flirted with the female officers. He wore his RAF uniform proudly, as if daring the detectives to see him as anything but honourable. But the evidence was undeniable. The women knew his face. The timeline matched his leave dates. His fingerprints were found on weapons. His personal items, rings, watches, even a cigarette case, were discovered in his quarters. Souvenirs stolen from his victims. Cummins wasn't just a killer. He was a collector, and his trophies told the real story, one of obsession power and escalating violence. He didn't need to murder for money. He didn't do it out of madness. He did it because he could, because he liked it, and because in a city shrouded in blackout, no one was watching. But now the lights were back on, and the Blackout Ripper was finally exposed. When Gordon Frederick Cummins was arrested on February 16, 1942, London had no idea that one of its darkest monsters had just been caged. The war still raged. Air raid sirens still wailed. But for the first time in weeks, the fear that had crept silently through the hearts of London's women was given a name and a face. And that face wore a uniform. News of the arrest didn't break immediately. The authorities, wary of sparking public panic in the middle of a world war, kept a tight grip on the investigation. But inside Scotland Yard, the case was unfolding rapidly. Evidence was piling up faster than expected, because Cummins, for all his cunning in murder, had been careless in cover-up. When police searched his belongings, what they found left no room for doubt. In his personal RAF-issued kit bag, investigators discovered a small collection of jewellery, rings, watches, a silver cigarette case. Each piece matched items reported missing from his victims. One of the rings had the initials E.O., Evelyn Oatley. Another, a bracelet belonging to Margaret Lowe. His room was a shrine of stolen memories, relics, plucked from bodies like prizes in a twisted game. But perhaps the most damning clue of all was the gas mask. Left behind at the hotel after his failed attack on Greta Hayward, the mask had his service number etched into the rubber. It wasn't circumstantial. It was forensic, cold, absolute, and it sealed his fate. Forensics teams rushed to match fingerprints found at the murder scenes. They lifted prints from curling irons, tin openers, broken mirrors, all tools used in the mutilations. Every fingerprint led back to one man, Gordon Cummins. The press, starved for drama amid the bleakness of war, caught wind of the developments. Though wartime censorship kept most of the gory details out of the headlines, whispers turned into printed words: Soho murderer captured, airman held in serial killings. And finally, unofficially, a nickname surfaced: the Blackout Ripper. It was a name that both honoured and feared. What he had done, used the cover of war, the very thing meant to unite a nation, to fracture it from within. His trial began just 2 months later, on April 27, 1942, at the Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed: journalists, civilians, even soldiers on leave who had read about the mysterious Soho killer in hushed conversations. Outside, the blitz continued. But inside those walls, a different war was being fought, one for the truth. Cummins pleaded not guilty. He sat calmly in the defendant's box, wearing a perfectly pressed RAF uniform, clean-shaven, his hair neatly parted. He showed no emotion as the prosecution laid out the evidence, one body after another. One night after another. One mutilation more gruesome than the last. The prosecution focused primarily on the murder of Evelyn Oatley, the second victim. Why? Because the forensic evidence in her case was overwhelming. Cummins' fingerprints were found on the murder weapons. His possessions matched items stolen from her room. Witnesses placed him in the area that night. And above all, the level of brutality mirrored his other suspected killings with chilling precision. Even with all this, Cummins stuck to his story. He'd never met Evelyn. He denied everything. He was polite, poised, even slightly amused. It was the same performance he had mastered for years, charming, deflecting, untouchable. But this time the act wasn't working. Greta Hayward took the stand. Her testimony was powerful, calm, but unmistakably firm. She described the air raid shelter, his voice, his hands, the sudden violence, the chilling words he whispered as he tried to strangle her. She looked straight at Cummins as she spoke. He didn't flinch. Then came the forensic expert, detailing the fingerprint matches, the unique abrasions, the exact angle of the bruises on Evelyn Oatley's neck compared to the spacing of Cummins' fingers. It was meticulous, scientific, irrefutable. The jury didn't take long. After just 35 minutes of deliberation, they returned with a verdict guilty. The judge wasted no time. "You are a cunning and savage murderer," he said coldly. "Your crimes are the product of a diseased mind and a chilling disregard for human life." The sentence, death by hanging. But what shocked the public even more than the verdict was how Cummins reacted. He smiled. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A curl of the lips, a flicker of ego, as if the whole trial had been a performance and he was the star. In the days that followed, Cummins remained emotionless in prison. He declined to appeal. He spoke little. He continued to insist on his innocence, but showed no signs of fear. No regret, only pride. It was as if in his mind he had already won, because in his twisted worldview the murders were not crimes, they were achievements. He had beaten the war. He had taken life in a city obsessed with preserving it, and in doing so he believed he had become immortal. But immortality would not come. On June 25th, 1942, just 2 months after his conviction, Gordon Frederick Cummins was executed at Wandsworth Prison. At 8:00 a.m., he was led to the gallows by Thomas Pierrepoint, Britain's official hangman. The procedure was swift, cold, mechanical. There were no final words, no poetic last statement, just silence. And then it was over. The man who had terrorized London's nights under the cover of darkness was finally buried in it. But while his body was gone, his shadow remained. And for many, it still does. Because the Blackout Ripper wasn't a monster from myth or legend. He wasn't the product of some ancient curse. He was a man, polite, charming, educated, and that was the most terrifying truth of all. The execution of Gordon Cummins brought legal closure. A guilty man had been hanged. Justice, as far as the courts were concerned, had been served. But on the streets of London, justice felt far less clear. Because while the Blackout Ripper was gone, the fear he sowed continued to ripple like a bloodstain that wouldn't wash out. The city was left to ask itself a question few dared voice aloud. How did we let this happen? The newspapers, finally freed from wartime censorship, began publishing the full horror of Cummins' crimes. The descriptions of mutilated bodies, the surgical precision, the coldness, the ritual. It stunned a public already shell-shocked by the war. For many Londoners, it was almost too much to comprehend. A serial killer, in uniform, in our city, while bombs rained from the sky. It felt obscene, like an intrusion of something too evil to fit even within the madness of war. But it had happened. And worse, he had gone undetected for days, possibly longer, stalking the streets freely under the guise of national service. Women in particular were furious. Many had been among the first to suspect that the crimes were not random. The whisper network among sex workers had noticed the patterns early on. The violence, the mutilation, the uniform. and yet few had been believed. Police had downplayed early concerns. The press had concealed the severity. Now, with Cummins dead, those same women were asking, would this have happened if the victims had been someone else? The uncomfortable truth was, this Cummins had deliberately chosen women he believed no one would fight for. Sex workers, widows, working-class girls, women surviving in a world that offered them little protection. He chose them because they were vulnerable. He chose them because society had made them disposable. It wasn't just murder, it was predation. The case sparked conversations about the safety of women during wartime that had previously been buried beneath the rubble. Blackouts were meant to protect the city from bombs, but for many women, the darkness brought a different kind of terror. The war had stripped the city of light, of order, of community, and predators had filled the vacuum. In the weeks after Cummins' execution, Scotland Yard faced public scrutiny. How had he not been caught sooner? He committed 4 murders in as many nights, all within the same area, all following a strikingly similar pattern. It wasn't until a failed attack with a gas mask left behind that he was arrested. Even then, the connection to previous murders had taken days to confirm. Behind closed doors, the Metropolitan Police knew the truth. They had been overwhelmed. War had stretched resources thin. Investigators had been pulled away from routine crimes to assist with bomb recovery, security, and morale. And above all, there had been the censorship. The British government, afraid of causing hysteria or damaging morale, had kept the press on a tight leash. The public didn't know what was happening, which meant they didn't know how to protect themselves. Even as women were dying, the scandal spurred reforms. In the months following Cummins' arrest, internal police protocols were updated for tracking patterns of violent crimes, especially those involving vulnerable populations. The idea of a serial killer wasn't fully formed yet in public consciousness, but the need for proactive investigations into repeat offender patterns became a more prominent discussion. Women's safety groups, though, largely grassroots and unofficial, began organizing self-defense classes. Some distributed guides for navigating blackout zones. Others lobbied for better street patrols in high-risk areas. One pamphlet simply read, "We survive Hitler. We will survive men like him too." But the case had effects beyond policy and protection. It infected the culture. Wartime Britain had prided itself on unity, keep calm, and carry on. But the Cummins case shattered the illusion that all threats came from outside, that monsters wore swastikas and flew bombers, that evil was easy to spot. The Blackout Ripper was British, educated, sophisticated. He wore the king's uniform, and that fact shook people to their core. Authors and playwrights began incorporating versions of the story into fiction. The image of the charming man with a hidden knife became a motif in radio dramas. The danger under the blackout became a trope that outlived the war itself, and the phrase Blackout Ripper took on a mythology all its own, spoken in hushed tones like Jack the Ripper decades before. But for the women who survived him, the mythology felt hollow. Greta Hayward, the woman who escaped Cummins and whose testimony helped convict him, never returned to normal life. Friends said she avoided crowds, flinched at sudden noises, and refused to ever walk alone again. Her life had been spared, but peace of mind that had been strangled out of her in that air raid shelter. Others, like the family of Evelyn Oatley and Margaret Lowe, dealt with a different kind of torment. Their loved ones were remembered only as victims, their names synonymous with mutilation. In a war that took so much, the Blackout Ripper had found a way to take more to rob women of their dignity, even in death. Still, amid the grief, there was resilience. Survivors became advocates. Families demanded reforms. And even as the war pressed on with its bombs and rationing and heartbreak, Londoners made a quiet vow: never again would darkness be mistaken for safety. And yet the most haunting lesson of all wasn't about shadows. It was about masks, because Gordon Cummins had shown the world something terrifyingly simple. Evil doesn't always snarl. It doesn't always wear a villain's face. Sometimes it wears a smile, a uniform, a polished pair of boots. Sometimes evil is the man you trust to walk you home. To understand the terror of Gordon Frederick Cummins, you must go beyond the headlines, beyond the blood, beyond the uniform. You must enter his mind not to excuse, but to expose. Because what makes the Blackout Ripper so haunting is not simply what he did, but how disturbingly normal he seemed. Unlike many serial killers, Cummins did not fit the popular mold of the broken child or visibly unstable loner. There was no history of violent outbursts in his youth, no dark family tragedy. He was educated, polite, and above all, charming. This was not a man who skulked in alleyways. He walked proudly in polished boots, offering cigarettes and smooth conversation. His smile was his camouflage, his uniform a weapon. But under the surface, there were cracks, hairline fractures in his personality that under the pressure of war split wide open. Psychologists who studied his case in later years would call Cummins a classic example of a malignant narcissist. He believed deeply in his superiority, not just in terms of class or intelligence, but in entitlement. He felt owed the world, and when the world didn't offer him what he wanted, he took it. There were early signs. In his youth, Cummins was known to lie compulsively. He invented stories of aristocratic lineage, claiming to be the illegitimate son of noble birth. He would wear gloves indoors, carry a cane unnecessarily, and correct people's grammar with theatrical flair. He didn't want to belong to the working class, he wanted to transcend it. But lacking the money or bloodline to do so, he substituted fantasy for fact. Reality to Cummins was negotiable. He wasn't just pretending to be upper class. He believed he deserved to be. This delusion of grandeur eventually hardened into resentment. The war was supposed to elevate him. He believed wearing the RAF uniform made him better than other men. He used it not as a badge of duty, but as a license for superiority. Every salute reinforced his ego. Every stare from a passing woman became confirmation that he was desired, important, irresistible. But in truth, Cummins was profoundly insecure. His charm was scripted, his confidence brittle. Underneath the suave exterior lay a profound hatred for women, for weakness, for anything that reminded him of his own fragility. This hatred metastasized during the war. The blackouts, the fear, the chaos, it all gave him permission to unleash the person he always believed he could be. A man above the rules, beyond judgment, outside morality. In the safety of night, he became the thing he truly believed himself to be powerful. He didn't just murder. He dominated. He mutilated. He posed his victims with deliberate cruelty. These were not random acts of violence, they were performances. Each killing was a script in which he played the starring role. The use of objects curling irons can open as razors was no accident. These were domestic tools, symbols of femininity twisted into instruments of death. It was as if he was punishing these women, not just for being vulnerable, but for being women. To Cummins, their existence was disposable. Their suffering, the price of his pleasure. Some experts theorized that his sadism was sexual in nature, that he could only feel aroused in scenarios where he held absolute control. The crime scenes suggest this. Victims were stripped, mutilated post-mortem, often in grotesque poses meant to shock. It wasn't just about death, it was about desecration. And yet what's most chilling is this. Cummins didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as clever, as bold, as someone who could outwit the system because he was smarter than it. He was wrong. When Greta Hayward fought back, she shattered the illusion. She was the first person to confront the fantasy he had built. And when police followed the trail to his gas mask, his world of lies collapsed. But in the days after his arrest, he never admitted guilt. He offered no confessions, no apologies. He stuck to the script the noble airman wrongly accused. When asked about the evidence, he simply shrugged. When shown the stolen jewelry, he claimed they were gifts. When told his fingerprints were on the murder weapons, he said nothing. There was no breakdown, no emotional collapse, no begging. Instead, Cummins used his trial as a stage. He dressed sharply, spoke eloquently, and tried until the end to play the role of a misunderstood gentleman. The jury wasn't fooled. But the fact that so many had been fooled before, that was what terrified the public most. Because if someone like Cummins could kill, who else might be hiding behind the mask of charm? His case sparked new conversations in British psychiatry, particularly around the concept of the socialized psychopath. A person who could mimic empathy, blend into society, and pass as normal, until the mask slipped. The term serial killer wouldn't become popularized for decades. But even in 1942, experts knew they had witnessed something new, a predator who used the very symbols of trust, uniform, civility class, to disarm his victims. Gordon Cummins didn't kill in spite of being ordinary. He killed because he weaponized that ordinariness, and that realization would leave a permanent scar on the psyche of wartime Britain, because it meant that in the blackout you didn't just fear the sirens. You feared the man who offered to walk you home, the smile in the shadows, the kindness that felt just a little too practiced. And long after Cummins' body swung lifeless at Wandsworth Prison, that fear remained. The war would end, the lights would return. But in the minds of Londoners, the true horror wasn't the bombs from above. It was the monster in plain sight, who wore a hero's uniform and carried death in his hands. By the time Gordon Frederick Cummins was executed in 1942, Britain had already endured the worst of the Blitz. The bombs that had rained down on London were gradually replaced by sirens of warning and eventual silence. But for many, a deeper unease remained, not about Germany or Hitler or the future of Europe, but about something far more intimate. The Blackout Ripper had changed the way people saw each other. The trust that once ran silently through everyday interactions had been compromised, and it would never fully return. Though the war would rage on for 3 more years, the crimes of Cummins carved out a separate kind of historical trauma, one not spoken about in military terms, but psychological ones. His actions had invaded the domestic sphere, the very fabric of normal life, and transformed the act of walking home at night into a game of Russian roulette. And yet, even in the face of horror, something strange happened. He became a legend, not in celebration but in haunting. Newspapers, no longer shackled by wartime censorship after VE Day in 1945, began reprinting the full details of Cummins' crimes. Stories that had been suppressed or minimized were suddenly splashed across the front pages: the mutilations, the eerie politeness, the eerie silence of the nights in which he struck. Writers and journalists began referring to him as the 21st century Jack the Ripper, not because of proximity, but because of impact. The psychological scars left by Cummins mirrored those left by Jack more than half a century earlier. Both killers had targeted women. Both had stalked London's streets under cover of darkness. And both had left behind questions that would haunt the city long after their deaths. In many ways, the Blackout Ripper was the darker echo of Jack the Ripper, less flamboyant, but more insidious. Where Jack had chosen Whitechapel alleys and left taunting letters, Cummins chose the respectable air of hotels and boarding houses. Where Jack had vanished without a trace, Cummins had blended into society, sat among soldiers, smiled at officers, wore the King's badge on his chest. This contrast only amplified his infamy. Soon, the media turned his story into a kind of myth. True crime radio plays dramatized his murders. Post-war magazines republished interviews with detectives who had worked the case. Sensationalist titles referred to him as the gentleman killer or the devil in dress blues. And always, with photographs that showed his neat RAF uniform, perfectly tied necktie, and boyish, unassuming smile. It was this dissonance, the appearance of refinement, hiding a capacity for cruelty that captivated and horrified in equal measure. But it wasn't just the media that took notice. Criminologists began using Cummins' case as a template for understanding a new kind of predator. For the first time, British law enforcement was forced to confront the idea that serial killers weren't necessarily monstrous in appearance. That the men most dangerous to society could be those who looked just like everyone else, or worse, like heroes. Cummins' case became part of British police training modules in the post-war years. His psychological profile was dissected in early forensic psychology textbooks. His murders were analyzed as examples of how compulsive violence can escalate quickly when enabled by structural conditions. In his case, the chaos of war, the anonymity of blackouts, and the culture of silence. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was social. Women across Britain, especially in London, never quite saw the city the same way again. Before Cummins, the blackout had been seen as a shared inconvenience, something everyone endured together for the good of the nation. After Cummins, it became something else entirely, a cover, not just for bombs, but for predators. The streets weren't just dangerous because of what fell from the sky, but because of who walked them. Public awareness campaigns began popping up in women's magazines in the late 1940s, offering advice not just about wartime safety, but about recognizing danger in peacetime. The trust your instincts rhetoric, so common in self-defense culture today, had its early roots in this very era. The message was clear: it wasn't enough to fear the known. The real threat might smile, offer a light, and walk you into the dark. Books and novels inspired by the Blackout Ripper surfaced throughout the 1950s and 60s. Some leaned into the horror, others into the psychology. But the underlying tension was always the same: that a person can wear a uniform and still be a monster. In 1954, a fictionalized film, loosely inspired by the case Shadow in Soho, was quietly released. Though the name Cummins was never used, the story followed a charming RAF officer who used wartime blackouts to murder women across London. The film was poorly reviewed at the time, but has since gained a cult following among true crime historians for being one of the earliest cinematic depictions of a serial killer hiding behind state-sanctioned power. In more academic circles, the case of Cummins led to renewed interest in the intersection of war, masculinity, and violence. Was Cummins a one-off aberration? Or did war itself incubate these kinds of men? After all, war teaches men to kill, but it also teaches them to dehumanize, to view life as expendable. And for someone already predisposed to domination and narcissism like Cummins, war wasn't a break from society, it was an opportunity. An opportunity to act on impulses he might have otherwise buried. The war gave him darkness, the war gave him chaos, and the war gave him cover. But even after the war ended, the psychological impact remained. Parents warned their daughters differently. Strangers were met with more caution. The concept of stranger danger would take decades to fully develop, but seeds of that cultural shift were planted here in the fear that someone somewhere could be watching from the shadows, and that you'd never suspect him until it was too late. The city rebuilt, the lights returned, the bombs stopped falling. But in the quiet corners of London's history, one name still lingered. Not as a soldier, not as a casualty, but as a reminder of how evil sometimes wears a smile. When the story of Gordon Frederick Cummins finally broke into the public consciousness after the war, the British press had a decision to make: how to frame a man like this. A man in uniform, a man with charm, a man who looked, spoke, and acted like someone the nation had been taught to admire. What followed was a media storm, not just of information, but of interpretation. The Blackout Ripper would not be remembered simply as a killer. He would be remembered as a betrayal. The betrayal of image, the betrayal of trust, the betrayal of everything Britain wanted to believe about its protectors. Newspapers were eager to sell headlines in the wake of VE Day, and Cummins's story was irresistible. The juxtaposition between his clean-shaven, boyish looks and the sadistic violence of his crimes created a sensational narrative. But it also posed a dilemma. How do you make sense of someone who seems to violate all your assumptions? Some tabloids chose the grotesque route, emphasizing the butcher within the gentleman. They dubbed him the Bluebeard of the Blitz and ran headlines like Killer with a Kiss and Ripper in RAF Blues. But even as they sensationalized his brutality, they couldn't resist aestheticizing him. Photos of Cummins in his pristine Royal Air Force uniform, smiling, polished, dignified, accompanied articles that detailed the horrors of the mutilated bodies he left behind. It was cognitive dissonance in black and white ink. The respectable monster. This duality became part of the mythos. The media coverage focused not just on what Cummins did, but how he looked while doing it, or rather how normal he looked. The public's horror came not only from the crimes themselves, but from the shattering realization that evil could be so ordinary. It was a cultural reckoning. For years, Britain had leaned heavily on the image of the military man as hero-protector embodiment of national strength. Cummins perverted that image. His crimes raised uncomfortable questions. How many others had used the war, the blackouts, the uniforms as a cover? How many had gone unnoticed because no one dared suspect a man in uniform? The press coverage inadvertently revealed society's blind spots. That we trust appearances. That we assume civility means safety. That a polished accent and clean clothes equate to moral character. Cummins shattered that illusion. True crime columns from the late 1940s and early 1950s used his case as a morality tale. Not just about crime, but about gullibility. Don't trust the uniform became a subtext in many post-war detective novels and films. And yet, paradoxically, the media also elevated Cummins to near-mythical status. He became a villain in the public imagination, not just because of what he did, but because of how impossible it was to see him coming. The theatre of his trial only reinforced this. Journalists packed the courtroom. Sketch artists portrayed him not as a wild-eyed madman, but as a stoic, statuesque figure, calm, collected, even charming. It unsettled the public to see a man accused of such horrors behave with such composure. He was the perfect monster for a modern age because he didn't look like one. For women, the image of Cummins was particularly chilling. Survivors and witnesses described how easy it had been to let their guard down around him. He didn't leer. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise suspicion. He offered a light, a smile, a gentleman's voice in a city full of rough edges. And then he killed. The psychological manipulation wasn't just part of his crimes, it was the very foundation of them. He didn't use brute force to lure women. He used expectation. The expectation that a man in uniform would help you, not harm you. That the charming stranger was safer than the drunk in the alley. The press never let this detail go. Article after article fixated on the deception of his persona. And as they did, they accidentally cemented a dangerous archetype into the cultural consciousness, the killer who wears kindness like a mask. This archetype would be echoed in countless future stories, both fictional and real. From the suave villains of James Bond films to the chilling charm of real-world criminals like Ted Bundy, decades later, Cummins' legacy, however reluctantly, was that of a template. The man who blends in, the man who hides behind a smile, the man who seems incapable of evil, until it's too late. But not all media coverage glorified him. Some journalists, particularly female columnists in post-war Britain, pushed back against the mythologizing. They highlighted how the system had failed the victims, how censorship, institutional bias, and wartime distractions allowed Cummins to kill repeatedly before anyone noticed. These writers focused on the victims: Evelyn Hamilton, Evelyn Oatley, Margaret Lowe, Doris Joannet. They wrote about their lives, not just their deaths. They exposed how easily women could become statistics when society refused to listen, and how the true horror wasn't just Cummins' sadism, but the silence that allowed it. These voices laid the groundwork for a new kind of journalism, one that centered not the killer but the consequences, one that interrogated the systems that enabled predators rather than merely dramatizing their violence. In time, true crime journalism in Britain matured. It became more critical, more cautious of glorification. The lessons of Cummins and the mistakes made in his coverage helped shape that evolution. Yet even decades later, the specter of the Blackout Ripper lingers. He appears in documentaries, in books, in podcasts. His crimes still hold the power to shock, not just because of their brutality, but because of their elegance. The terrifying idea that evil could be elegant. In an era when war darkened every street and snatched away every sense of safety, Gordon Cummins walked among the rubble with a smile and used that smile to destroy lives. The media may have helped immortalize him, but it also helped us understand him, not just as a killer, but as a mirror held up to our own assumptions, our own blind faith in symbols, and the unsettling truth that sometimes what we fear most is the thing we never thought to question. The hanging of Gordon Frederick Cummins at Wandsworth Prison on June 25, 1942, was swift. The authorities made no public spectacle of it. The war was still raging, and the nation needed victories, not monsters. Newspapers mentioned it with muted headlines. No photographs, no lingering details. For all the horror he had wrought, Cummins was removed from public life as quickly as he had invaded it. But the echo of his crimes never really faded. In many ways, the silence that followed his death was more disturbing than the noise that had preceded it. Because while the execution ended, it did not end the fear. The lights came back on after the war. Streets were rebuilt. London healed. But in the minds of many, especially women, a terrible question remained: how many others like him had gone undetected, and how many still walked the streets? This wasn't a case that faded into historical obscurity. Instead, it became a dark reference point in British criminal history, used in lectures in police academies, in documentaries, in novels. The Blackout Ripper was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol, a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when evil wears a familiar face. In criminology circles, Cummins is still studied today, not because of the complexity of his crimes, but because of the simplicity of his disguise. He wasn't some grotesque figure hiding in the shadows. He was the man standing next to you in line, the one offering to carry your bag, the one holding the door with a smile. His murders forced society to confront the uncomfortable idea that evil could not only exist within normalcy, it could thrive in it. He weaponized social trust, the uniform, the charm, the voice. These weren't coincidences, they were tools, as sharp and deadly as any blade. The post-war years brought with them a new awareness of psychological disorders, particularly antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic psychopathy. Cummins became a textbook case, a man devoid of empathy, driven not by need but by entitlement. He didn't kill because he had to. He killed because he wanted to, because he could. Yet what makes his story uniquely disturbing isn't just the violence, it's the timing. Cummins committed his murders during Britain's darkest days, a time when people clung to each other for survival, when community meant safety, when neighbours watched out for one another. And into that fragile trust, he injected pure terror. He didn't just kill people, he killed peace. The murders had a chilling effect on public behaviour. Women who had once trusted in the camaraderie of the war effort now second-guessed every offer of help. Men became more cautious in their interactions with strangers, afraid of being mistaken for something sinister. The blackouts eventually ended, but the paranoia did not. In literature, Cummins would inspire dozens of fictional villains: the clean-cut killer, the charming sociopath, the man who doesn't look the type. His influence is traceable through generations of British crime drama, from Cracker to Luther to Broadchurch. The DNA of his crimes exists in the tension between trust and fear. In true crime culture, his name resurfaces often. Podcasts revisit the details of his week of horror. Books dissect his psychology. Documentaries recreate the gaslit streets he walked, the boarding houses he entered, the women who never walked out. And yet, unlike Jack the Ripper, Cummins didn't vanish into mystery. His guilt was proven, his identity known, his trial public, his death certain. There was no myth to unravel, only the brutal clarity of a man who did monstrous things and wore no mask to hide them. That perhaps is the scariest truth of all, because it forces us to reconsider the way we view danger. We like to imagine monsters are easy to spot, that evil announces itself, that killers are marked by some visible flaw. But Cummins was none of that. He was articulate, polished, employed. He had friends, a wife, a job. He was ordinary, and that ordinariness became his camouflage. Even today, law enforcement agencies around the world train their officers with one lesson repeated endlessly: don't trust appearances. And Cummins is why. His crimes redefined the British understanding of serial murder. Before him, the idea of a spree killer during wartime, someone who preyed on fellow citizens while bombs fell from the sky, seemed unimaginable. He shattered that illusion, and he did so not with innovation but with audacity. He was the man who exploited darkness, both literal and metaphorical, who used the fear of war not to unite, but to isolate, to corner, to control. He turned the city's blackout into his hunting ground. And for 1 week in February 1942, he turned London into a living nightmare. Today, few walk the streets of Soho thinking about Gordon Cummins. His name doesn't hang on plaques or war memorials. There are no statues, no public apologies, just footnotes in police records. But the women he killed, Evelyn Hamilton, Evelyn Oatley, Margaret Lowe, Doris Joanne, deserve to be remembered. They were not nameless. They were not faceless. They were not lessons. They were lives. Each had a story, a past, a future that was taken from them. They trusted the wrong man in the wrong moment during the worst possible time, and for that they paid the price. So we tell this story not to glorify a killer, not to sensationalize his deeds, but to remember, to warn, to remind ourselves that safety is never guaranteed, that the monsters we fear are not always strangers in the dark, but sometimes the very people we're told to trust. Because evil doesn't always look like a threat. Sometimes it wears a uniform, offers a smile, and waits until the lights go out.